The storm was closing in when a mysterious cowboy emerged. Wind came first, a long, low voice that ran over the prairie and found the sod house like a knife finding the seam of a coat. It pressed at the roof, made the chimney cough smoke back into the room. Ellen held Samuel close to her shoulder, the boy's small weight a warm stubbornness beneath her chin. The youngest slept mostly, shivering in a shirt too thin and hands too small to reach his own cheeks. Outside, the world was a wash of grey and white. Inside, a kettle sang faintly, a thin pulse of steam that might have been hope. Levi sat by the hearth with his head bent over a bit of leather, stitching a strap with a thread that had frayed and been reborn a dozen times. Ruth lay on the bed at the far wall, her face thinner, but the color returning in slow, stubborn flares. Norah moved without sound, a shadow among shadows, stacking kindling or mending socks. The house smelled of broth and smoke and the sour linen of a life that had been scrubbed and mended and scrubbed again. They had been waiting for storms. They had not been waiting for a knock that sounded like something wrapped in leather. The knock came once, not loud, not demanding, just a single deliberate sound against the plank of the door. It set the room taut. Someone glanced up, and for a moment the wind filled the space like a held breath. Ellen opened the door to a face rimed with frost and a hat that had seen more roads than any map in the county. His coat was dusted white. His boots had a crust of mud that told of long rides. He held neither sack nor claim, only a pack slung across a saddle, and a man whose hands were steady as a clock. "Evening," he said. His voice was quiet, the kind that measured words as much as breath. "Reckon you got room for someone on their way?" Ellen looked past him to the field half hidden under snow, to a small white figure that was her youngest brother's sleep. She looked at the damp line of his collar where the snow had melted into cloth, at the man's hands, at the way his jaw tightened around something no one had asked him to carry. Hospitality was not a luxury where she lived. It was a ledger kept in small debts and credits, supper for labor, shelter for honesty. The man stood straight. There was no swagger in him that belonged to stories. "Warm yourself by the hearth," Ellen said. "Come in." He stepped into the house as if stepping into a prayer, removing gloves that left small dark prints on the hearthstone. For a while he said nothing but let the warmth draw the frost from his face. He did not take up more space than he needed. He accepted the bowl that Norah set before him with a nod that held thanks like a coin. "You a writer?" Levi asked, not looking up. "Name's Colt," he said, "looking to trade my hands for a bed for the storm." Small hands watched him. Samuel, stirred awake by the new shadow, peered from beneath a blanket, eyes wide as if the man and the wind were part of the same thunder. Ellen kept her voice even. "We don't have much to trade." "You got a hearth," Colt said, "and that's more than some have." He set his pack near the doorway and loosened his gaitered legs. He moved with a practiced ease, saddling horse lines, rolling sleeves, stacking wood without making a show of it. The house, which had been a score of frayed routines, shifted to include him like a new line in a ledger. He took up the chore of boiling the kettle and made the sort of small, careful motions that taught rather than boasted. When he stirred the broth, he did it in silence. When he mended a torn strap for Levi, he did it without instruction, the needle finding leather as if it belonged to him. Days folded into one another with the pace of chores. The storm pressed and then rested like a patient animal at the house's doorstep. Snow came and melted and came again. There were times when the world beyond the yard was a white wash, and times when the thaw bled along the ribs of the fields like a slow return of color. Each morning, Ellen would wake to find Colt already up, already with his world arranged. He would be at the well, hauling a bucket of water with the same sturdy economy of motion as a man who had learned to keep many small fires alive at once. He did not speak of the roads he had ridden or the reasons he'd stopped at a sod house on the edge of nowhere. Instead, he offered things that mattered. A hand steady enough to lift a trapped hen, the knowledge of when to split saplings so they might dry without rotting, a quiet way of sitting through the worst of Ruth's fevers without saying that all would be well. When Ruth coughed and the cough hollowed her, Colt rubbed her back with the flat of his palm and asked for nothing. When Norah's fingers were too cold to thread a needle, Colt warmed them with his own and showed her the simple loop that made a stitch hold. If kindness were measured by sound, Colt's was the scratch of boot leather against a door in the morning, the soft swap of a bowl placed upon the table. There were no declarations, only a steady accrual of small proofs. "You taught Levi how to set a snare," Norah remarked one morning as they bent over a feathered bird that had been caught by a tripwire set at Colt's suggestion. She said it less as an observation than a fact to be added to their ledger. Colt wiped the blade of the knife he had used. "It's work that keeps men fed. Knowing how to set a loop matters when the ground is white and seeds are poor." Levi, who had always been a quiet boy of hands ready for labor, met Colt's eyes and offered him the bird without the need to say more. In the exchange was a new currency. Trust given, trust answered. The bird would be plucked and trimmed and add to the broth that went into the center pot each evening. There were things a man could not buy, and kindness was among them. People in the small radius of the homestead took stock of Colt with a caution that, over time, thinned into acceptance. He did not intrude into the small, sharp gravity of their grief. He did not name their absent father. When Ellen cleared a place for him at the table, she did so as she had cleared many hard things, with a sense of necessity and with a surplus of restraint. Outside, the thaw began. Crows came with a cheeky confidence, pecking in mud that had been ice. The earth, which had seemed an unbreachable thing, let out a smell of wet leaf and old roots, a scent that felt like a promise. In the garden patch, Ellen found a small, stubborn shoot, green against the gray. She cupped it with rough fingers and felt a sharp private joy. The seeds they had buried in autumn were answering, in the slow way of things that outlast hard weather. Colt took to the chores that were the skeleton of their days. He broke ice in the trough, set the feed, and when the roof leaked in one corner, he climbed and supplanted the sod with a patch of nearer matching earth. He taught Levi in small steady steps to check the wind by the way a chimney smoked, to tell whether a cough in a child needed only broth or the sweet of willow bark. Even the children noticed the difference not as fact but as warmth. There was an evening when Ellen found him sitting on the back stoop, rubbing a coin-sized silver button between his fingers. The metal had lost some shine where the thumb met it, but he kept it with the reverence of a man who kept his few ornaments for reasons he would not unfold. She did not ask, he did not offer. "Been a rough season for buttons," Norah said from the doorway, and the remark made the room a smidgen less guarded. Colt smiled with the ease of someone who had learned to let small things pass. "They hold people up better than sometimes you'd think." On other nights, Colt would sit with Samuel in his lap and whittle a bit of wood into a shape that might become a toy. He whittled slowly, and Samuel would watch the curls fall like small promises. Sometimes the boy would blink and ask a question that seemed too large for his years. "Did you ever have a friend, Colt?" And Colt would answer with a look that implied he had known many friends and lost some of them as one loses gloves. He never told the stories fully. Instead, he gave what was usable: a steady hand at the plow, a foot that could hold ground in the dark. Life in the house became an alternation of small economies: time traded for work, soup for repair, warm blankets for honest labor. The ledger of living was kept in the faces of the children and the lines of Ellen's hands, which had learned to do a dozen people's work at the same time. She had not wanted another burden, but the house's needs were many, and Colt's help was not taken as alms but as a joining. There were moments in which he almost became visible as a man apart. A half-glance when a name he did not speak came near his lips, a hand over a scar on his knuckle that looked newly faded. Once he woke in the night and went to the door as if to leave, but the step stopped in him and he sat back down, breathing as if testing the air. He did not say anything afterward. His past, if there was one that pressed on him like a weather front, remained a low cloud. Neighbors began to notice a change as well. Mrs. Harlan across the ridge brought a sack of flour one morning and stood on their porch like a pilgrim between privacy and necessity. "Figured you could use it," she said, her eyes flicking toward Colt with the quickness of someone tallying favors. She left as she had come, the exchange working like a gentle law. They had fed her with kindness at kinship time once, and now she returned the favor when winter's last teeth were showing. People came in small delegations then, an extra blanket from the smith, a can of lard, a pie that had seen more prayers than sugar. The way charity moved in a place like theirs was quiet and practical. It was not a thing that sought to make a show. It was work that kept households from collapsing, a network of ropes tied under the floors of many homes. Colt moved among this web as if he knew how it was knitted. He accepted gifts with a nod and gave back the things he could. One morning he took Levi and Norah to a neighbor's barn to help move hay, and they returned with a head of cabbage so large it seemed almost a joke. The household made instant plans for a stew worthy of a harvest. The thaw continued, and with it the small, steady returns of bodies mending. Ruth coughed less each day, color crept back into her cheeks. Her laugh, when it came, was careful, like a bird testing a wing. She sat by the window sewing a shirt for Samuel, and paused to press her sleeve to her mouth as if testing that the life in her was real. Levi had taken to walking the fields, checking the soil, marking where seeds might be sown in earnest. Norah, who had learned to keep everything inside, began to speak more across the table, as if the warmth of the room let her words out in less measured tranches. Colt's presence folded gently into all of this. He remained a man of small sentences and greater acts. When the children's school books arrived late, damp at the corner, he took the binding and dried it by the low flame without fuss. When the stroller wheel threatened to come loose, he fashioned a pin from a scrap of wire and bent it so the tire would turn straight again. He did not ask for thanks. He did not seek their names to hold like trophies. He asked for work, and he paid in kind. But even as hearth and hand repaired themselves, there was the small, hard layer of worry that lay beneath Ellen, like a patch of frost waiting for sunlight. Papers lived in a drawer in the kitchen, folded and refolded until their creases were cartography of fear. Once, after the children were in bed, she took out one of those papers and smoothed it against the table. It was an old ledger, Edgar M. Talbot's hand gone angular where it had once been sinew. They had read parts of it aloud in the beginning, names, debts, the thin arithmetic of survival. The end of it had been a letter, an absence that took the shape of accusation. Ellen kept her answers in the ledger, the names of men who had seen Edgar off with a kind of last handshake, the dates when bills had been paid, the fact that their occupation of the land had never been anything but honest. She had kept every receipt she could. It was tedious labor, the kind that sifts truth from the dust, but she was beginning to understand that sometimes a life was defended by the small carefulness of record-keeping. Colt noticed the ledger one morning on the table, the edge of paper showing like a pale tooth. He ran a finger along the fold and lifted it. "Old finger work," he said. "You keep a careful count." "We keep what we can," Ellen answered. He signed a paper and then he took a road off of it. "People sign papers for reasons," Colt observed. "Sometimes for money, sometimes to make it look like they did." There was a pause in which the kettle hissed and the room decided what to do with its breath. Ellen looked at Colt as if evaluating the grain of a new tool. "Do you know about land, Colt?" she asked. It was not a question for the sake of learning as much as a test of whether the man who had stepped through their door had the sight for the things that could keep them. He hummed, a small sound. "I've seen a man lose a place before," he said. "Seen another take it over because he had the paper and the gumption to press it. If you got paper, you got a thing that speaks in town. Without paper, you got only what you can show." Ellen folded the ledger close and let the moment go. There were things a woman could not say aloud without making them real. She had learned to save those words. But threats do not wait on the count of spoken fear. They come in forms that are polite and folded, like letters. The letter arrived on a late morning when the sky was a dull pewter, and the wind played small, cruel games with the ash in the yard. A rider had come with a summons, a paper from a town man who called himself Martin Keene, a land agent who could write words to cut with the coolness of a bank ledger. He had been attuned to the fact that small places could be pressed and turned until something gave. Ellen held the paper as if it might burn. The words on it were neat and certain. It spoke of abandonment, of claims made, of a right to a survey if proper restitution was not paid. The letter was the kind of thing that wore no face, only the inked authority of a world that measured property in lines and signatures. "Guess they got a notion," Levi said, quiet, leaning back from the table as if the room had tilted. Ruth made a small sound. "Edgar never left the house without his signatures," she said. The memory of Edgar M. Talbot was a thin thread that ran through the house like a seam. He had been the absent hand, to whom blame and blame's absence alike could be assigned. Colt took the letter with his gloved hand and read it slowly. There were no theatrics in his approach. He folded it with the care of a man who knew papers had teeth and could guard them with a steady jaw. He set it on the table and looked at Ellen, not with pity but with the pragmatic air of a man tallying what was to be done. "You got witnesses," he said eventually. "Men that can say the place was worked. Receipts. The ledger's a start." Ellen felt the weight of years pressed down, food and seed in a ledger. These were the tools they had carved out from the bone of their days. She had kept receipts in the hem of a coat, the exchange of grain for labor written in a hand that had once been sure. Now those small accounts were about to be called before a man in a better jacket. Colt rose and swung his hat onto his knee, the movement casual as the drawing of breath. "I can ride to town," he said. "See what's stamped on that paper. See if the inked part's all they got, or if there's something else to press against it." Ellen thought of the children, of Ruth's fragile breath, of Norah's tight smiles. She thought of the ledger again, how the lines of ink might be the mortar between them and a greater absence. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "You don't have to," she said, and the sentence came out small and practical. He was already moving, steady as a man who had thought his departure through like the sharpening of a blade. "If you want help, I'll go," he said. "If you don't, I won't. Ain't my place to make the choice for you." The offer was not a rescue, and that was what made it possible to take. It was movement, work, something that would be measured in miles and signatures and witnesses. Ellen nodded. She felt the ledger as a thin plank beneath her feet. She was tired of standing at the edge of things. It was time to go stand in the middle. "Then ride with care," she told him. "Don't make too fast a promise. In town, people talk in a way that can thin truth." Colt looked as if he had never been told to promise anyway. He tapped the coin-sized button he kept, and for a second, Ellen thought she saw something like a memory pass over his face. A man in another house, perhaps. A hand that had given a button in the past as a token. He rose without fuss, put his hat on, and stepped out into the broom of the yard where the thaw met the last of winter's teeth. The horse stamped in the snow and shook beads from his mane. Colt's boots met the stirrup. He turned at the gate and, as if answering a question no one had asked, tipped his hat once at the house. The knock motif had become, in a small way, a rhythm of arrivals and departures. "Ride careful," Norah called, the word as much a benediction as any prayer. He nodded and pulled the reins. The animal moved in a measured cadence, hooves sounding on the thawing soil like small instruments in a larger score. The figure of Colt receded into a line of grey and dust, into the place where a road might begin and a town might lie with its own set of rules in ink. He would be gone for a day or two, Ellen guessed, or perhaps longer. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if the departure of one steady thing had left a space where the hearth had to work harder. Ellen returned to the ledger and smoothed the pages. There were names on them, there were dates, there were little notations, how much seed traded for how much labor, the count of hens before and after a winter's turn. These were the marks of a life. She set the ledger in a bag and put a pair of boots with a toe cloth in beside it. Things she would have to admit were necessary were the worst to be asked. When Colt returned, the light would be different. Town would have tested him. His boots might bear ink that smelled of vinegar and paper. He might come back with a printed thing that read like a verdict, or he might come back calmer, carrying stories folded into the seat of his saddle. He might come back with the forms of a man who had argued with clerks and left no room for them to press him. He might come back with none of these. He left, and the house resumed its slow work of survival. Without his shoulder to lean upon at the well, they all bent a little more into the tasks. The children played with the whittled toy, the blade they had sharpened finding a safe rhythm in their hands. Ruth hummed a song that might once have been a hymn or a lullaby. No one asked where she had learned it. Norah sat by the window and watched for Colt's return, and in watching she measured herself against the horizon. The days stretched thin and then coiled. Colt rode into town with a purposeful thing in his breast, and Ellen turned the pages of receipts and names. She laid out the ledger again, bowing her head to the small kind of prayer that comes from folding things neat. Town was a gray place when Colt got there, the streets of Thaw full of horsebed and grit. He rode up to the county clerk's office, where a man in a starched collar looked at him as if he were some commodity. The clerk's hands were neat as pages, and he asked the sort of questions meant to fold a man's case into a folder and then into a drawer. Colt answered in his slow, quiet way. He did not seek a show of righteousness. He sought a record. He found that the ledger's teeth were sharp in town. Martin Keene's name carried with a certain heft. Keene had the loose, practiced manners of a man who had turned other men's lands into a business model. He was polite enough and steady enough to have the smell of velvet and ledger ink. Colt met him with a quietness that was not easily shaken. It took 2 days to gather the necessary things. Colt waited with the patience of one who knew how time liked to show its face only when coaxed. He collected signatures from a man who had come to the house to trade a cow for labor 3 winters past, from a neighbor who had taken on a borrowed span of plow, from the postmaster who remembered Edgar's name and his habit of mailing receipts. Each signature was small, sanctioned by the sort of memory that requires no paper to be true, but which becomes valuable when ink is invited to confirm it. Back at the sod house, Ellen kept the hearth going and found ways to make bread from less flour. She mended boots and stitched sleeves. The daily life of survival played between them like a tether. When Colt returned, sore from riding but bearing no tails wound too tight, he brought with him stippled papers and the faces of men who had remembered. He set them on the table like small shields. Ellen let herself believe they might hold. For a moment there was a hush that tasted of something that might be victory. They read the papers and folded them. There was a quiet consolation in a signature that said you had been where you said you had. The house breathed with the measure of that consolation. If shelter and signatures were a kind of defense, then testimony was the next layer. Colt spoke quietly to neighbors, and they remembered events and names as if repeating a creed. Mrs. Harlan said she had seen Edgar at the well in the spring of the year he was suspected to have been gone. The Smiths swore he had hammered a hinge on their barn while Edgar's hands were busy at the house. The postmaster produced a faded slip that matched the dates etched in Ellen's ledger. These small corroborations lined up like fence posts. They were not dramatic, they were slow and honest. They carried weight because they were woven from things that mattered: memory, honesty, the stubbornness of those who kept house and habit. The papers and the witnesses taken together were a metabolism of truth, but towns have their own economies of interest. Men like Martin Keene carried a kind of polite patience. He would not be moved by simple kindnesses. He would, where necessary, marshal the language of law, and the tone of his letters smelled of paper stored in drawers that were not easily opened. When the first messenger came back with the civility of a man bearing a rod instead of an axe, Ellen felt the house tilt. The messenger had a folded piece of paper and a small professional manner. He had the sort of softness that belonged to a man trained to keep people's tempers down by use of a pen rather than a voice. He read the letter to her, as if it were a thing that might comfort her by being certain. It said they had until the beginning of the next month to file formal claim. It said a survey would be made if the claim went unanswered. It wrapped its meaning in dignified words and left the hard part under the door. Ellen folded the letter into the ledger as if she could make it less sharp. She looked to Colt. He stood by the door, his silhouette a deliberate thing. They held each other with the small economy of people who knew that the next action would be measured and necessary. "Watch the children," Ellen said. "They'll need their mother." The words were practical and not sentimental. There were tasks to do, to gather witnesses, to count the goods, to make a case that the homestead was alive with people who worked the soil. A house, she had learned, was not defended by anger but by readiness. Colt nodded. "I'll be back in a few days," he said. "I'll go where the paper has teeth." He did not promise more than that. He took the ledger and made it his companion as if it were a weapon of paper and memory. He rode out, and the house prepared itself for the next waiting. The wind creaked as if taking stock. As the thaw pressed, small sounds became important. The thud of a boot on the porch, the scrape of a chair, the way a child's breath rose and fell during sleep. When Colt returned this time, he carried a file of additional signatures, and with them a manila envelope with a notation that a clerk had made. It read as if a hope had been put into the hands of the county, where the law's small machines might chew on it with their deliberate teeth. They set the ledger and envelopes beside the pot and ate in an order that had an unspoken ritual. Stew first, then pie of a sort, then the quiet exchange of a look that meant we have done all we can for now. Outside, the thaw waxed and waned. The field ahead of the house showed wet ridges and the promise of seed, but also the memory of ice that clung like an old man with stiff hands. Ellen went to bed that night with a feeling that she could not name. It was the sense that they had girded themselves, and the longer fight might be a test of stamina rather than a single battle. There was, under the fear, a new strand of possibility that edged into hope. The next morning, a wagon arrived with the smell of fresh lime and cedar. Neighbors had come, more than a passing courtesy, men with ropes and boards, women with jars of preserves, children with clumsy offers of help. They had come because the country had long known how to answer need with labor rather than words. They set to work lifting the sagging porch, patching the roof where the storm had pressed through, mending rails. The house was being reinforced in the kind of slow, practical solidarity that could not be bought by gentleness alone. Colt stood among them like a man who had simply been part of the fabric for longer than the measure of his arrival. He moved without saying much, taking tasks that were needed. He taught a neighbor how to set a beam so it would not slip, explaining in simple metaphors about the way the wood should breathe. He did not force his hand into the town's legal affairs beyond what was necessary. He returned again and again with small papers and witness slips folded into his coat, like talismans that might hold. The legal fight, when it came, would be a slow-motion thing, hearing after hearing, signatures that had to be borne in the light. It would be about the proof that a family had, in the teeth of winter, and the absence of a man named Edgar, kept a homestead alive. It would not be a thing decided by a single day. It would be a revelation more than anything of how much a community would stand to defend the simple right to be where one had been born and worked. In the evenings, when they had finished the day's labors, the house felt both fragile and offered. There were small exchanges between Colt and Ellen that did not clothe themselves in words. He left a small silver button on the table one night, face down and anonymous, and Ellen turned it over to find a slightly worn sheen that felt like an offering without conditions. She put it in her pocket like a small promise. Samuel woke sometimes and called for his father in sleep, a child's unfinished geography. Ellen would slip into the doorway and stand, feeling the light on the yard and the line of Colt's shadow by the hearth. He would stand and look, not intruding on the hollow where a name had been, but standing near it like a man keeping a watch. There would be more to come. Documents would be presented. A man in a fine jacket might arrive and call the house into question with a voice that was polite as a scalpel. The sheriff might have to be asked to hold his hand steady, but for the moment, they held their roster of small triumphs, a patched roof, a ledger full of names, a neighbor's hand, and the presence of a man named Colt, who had made himself useful without making himself indispensable. On a late afternoon when the light went long and the thaw had claimed more ground, a knock came at the door. It was a sound that had become a pattern in their lives, a measure of arrivals that changed the course of things. Ellen opened it to a man whose coat was a little too fine for the road and whose smile was calculated. Behind him, the snow sat in little storms along the road like a memory of winter. "Miss Talbot," he said, and his voice carried the polished cadence of a man named Martin Keene. He folded his hat in his hands as if it were a small offering. "I'm calling on behalf of the Keene estate. Might I step inside?" Ellen felt a small cold move through her. The man placed a card on the table with a practiced hand and opened a concern like a case. "I have some papers to discuss," he said, "if it's not an imposition." Colt, who had been mending a strap by the door, straightened and watched with the attention of a man measuring a kind of quiet. He did not speak at first. He let Keene's words slide into the room and put their weight on the table. Keene had the sort of smile that made small things thin. "I am not here to trouble you," he said, "only to see if we might reach an arrangement." Ellen kept her face as if it were a ledger. "We can meet and discuss," she said. "But we work the land. We live here." The man's expression glided over that as though it had been written in a language his ears simply did not translate. "The county has certain expectations," he said. "If you fail to comply, there are measures." Colt's hand flattened on the table like the settling of a weight. "We've been complying," he said. "We've been living and working and trading. There's a pile of witnesses and receipts if you fancy a look." Keene's lips pinched. "Certain matters are best handled with patience and, dare I say, the guidance of an agent?" He smiled then, and the smile was as smooth as a coin's face. "Perhaps you had not thought of that." Ellen felt the room tighten, each breath of wind now a participant. Keene's manner was slow and precise. He was the sort of man who could make a threat with a handshake. He placed a paper on the table that spoke in that same cool voice, a notice that steps would be taken if the claim went unanswered. Colt read it without show. He folded it into his hand, and then placed it on top of the ledger, as if it had become a weight to be balanced rather than a command to be obeyed. He looked at Ellen, and something in him steeled not with anger, but with a decided patience. His hand brushed the silver button in his pocket, as though finding the ground under his tongue. "You can go," he said to Keen, not loud, but carrying enough that the sentence set itself like a fence. "Take your papers, come back to the town and debate with the clerk, but don't expect the door to be opened by the sound of your authority alone." Keen looked taken aback for an instant, as if the directness had been unwanted. He drew himself up, proprietor of small, polished indignations. His smile did not quite arrive. "We shall see," he said. He left as he had come, the snow parting behind him with the slyness of a man accustomed to leaving marks and measuring how they would be accounted for. When he had gone, the house settled like a thing that had been half scolded. The children returned to their play as if the world were as it had been. Adults resumed their chores as if they had never ceased. Yet the paper on the table remained, a thin challenge. Colt sat, the hat-heavy line of him making no small drama. He rubbed at the silver button again. There are times, in a life like Ellen's, when actions say what words cannot. He stood and went to the door, where the wind had picked up and scraped the sky like something sharpening. "Town will take a bit," he said. "Keen's a man who will press. We need more than signatures. We need to make sure they cannot press this into a thing without witnesses present." Ellen nodded. She felt, in the marrow of herself, the shape of the next necessary return. They would bring witnesses. They would speak of labor and of presence. They would hold to the facts of the house, the hearth that had never been empty for a week's time, the records that had been kept, the men who had seen Edgar leave and who would swear that the place had not been abandoned but tended with care. Outside, the sky gathered its color. The thaw had won small victories and lost small ones. The wind that had first announced Colt now seemed to circle back like a reminder that no place was fixed. The house responded with more wood on the fire and hands that began the small labor of preparing for hearings, collecting receipts, refining testimony, making a case from the life they had kept. In the corner, Colt set out to mend a pair of harness straps, his fingers moving like the hands of a clock that had been taught to count in tasks. He did not tell them what he had seen in town, only that he had put down a claim and had taken a measure. He left the details to be fleshed out by lawyerly terms and local customs. He had the quiet knowledge that law was only as strong as the stories people were willing to bear in front of a man who recorded them. As the twilight slumped over the house, Ellen stood at the window and watched a wind-flattened strip of road. She saw the shape of a man in a hat, Colt, moving away and then returning with papers like small shields. She felt, in the slow places between heartbeats, the made things of a life, a ledger, a pot, a child's laugh. These things would be the answer if there were a question. They would be the proof in the face of a man like Keen who measured land with his mouth and ink. She put a hand on the ledger and smoothed its pages. The signatures were not enough in themselves, but they were the bones of a life, and bones could be used to build shelter when the body was weathered. At the table, Colt sat and, without any ceremony, placed the silver button on the ledger as if to mark it. Ellen watched the small metal circle in the lamplight. It was a token held in the simplest of gestures, something given, not claimed, something that might mean a beginning, but which was not itself a verdict. Outside, the night made the prairie feel like a great lung, breathing and holding at once. Inside, a kettle sang. A child turned in sleep. A child turned in sleep, a small fist finding the mended hem of a blanket as if it were a compass. The kettle eased into its long, low whine, and Ellen let the sound roll through her like water through cupped hands. Outside, the wind had gathered again, not sharp as before, but patient, testing the patched places where the house met the world. Inside, the ledger lay open on the table, a map of days that had been kept and days that must be kept yet. They moved through the next mornings with the quiet deliberation of people who have learned to measure danger by the chores it interrupts. Norah practiced speaking out loud what she might say in front of a man with a fine coat. Levi walked the fence line with Colt, and Colt showed him the small math of boards and stakes, where a post should be set so the wind would not take it, how nails should be sunk so the wood could swell and still hold. Colt's hands were steady on the mallet. They smelt faintly of sap and leather and the smoke of many hearths. The work in itself became a prayer, a slow, ritual thing that steadied nerves and made bodies ready. When the sheriff's horse came down the lane, it felt like some invisible bell being rung. The animal's hooves sounded damp and sure on the thawing ground, and Levi paused mid-stroke with a beam to watch the figure approach. A man in a dust-streaked star and a long coat, hat in hand, who looked as if he had been born to the long road of serving more than one interest. He dismounted with a slow, efficient motion and set his hat on his knee. He was not a man eager for spectacle. His face had that particular neutrality of those who have been asked to hold authority, but do not like the shape of the word. "Morning," he said. His voice did not aim to comfort. It was the voice of a man that kept decisions behind his teeth. "Miss Talbot." Ellen kept her face even as she stood to receive him. Colt was at her shoulder, as if by habit rather than design. The sheriff took in the house in one sweep, the patched roof, the children at the back, the ledger at the table, and nodded as if making note. "Martin Keene has sent a notice," the sheriff said. "Says he'll be present to discuss the claim, along with counsel if required. Asked me to be here to keep the peace." Ellen's fingers tightened around the ledger for a moment, but she let the hold go. "We have receipts and people who remember him," she said. "Edgar's name's in the post office records. Men remember plowing that spring." The sheriff glanced at Colt and then back at Ellen. "I'll hear both sides," he said simply. "But you know how it is. Folks in town follow rules, and sometimes them rules make a man think he ought to come out here with more than a letter." When Keene arrived, he stepped from his wagon with that same tidy smile and a paper case under his arm. He spread his hands as if presenting a small curiosity rather than a set of intentions. The sheriff remained near the door, a figure whose badge sat like a steady punctuation. Keene's voice was smooth as a ledger line. "I don't wish to make trouble," he began. "I'm merely the agent of those who hold the interest. There are procedures to be followed. I'm sure Miss Talbot understands the necessity of orderly transfer when claims are not addressed." Ellen looked at him in a way that had nothing to do with the softness of his tones. "We understand that you have a paper," she said. "We have people who worked with Edgar. We have receipts. We have a ledger. We have a house that has not been empty." Keene lifted a paper with a neat flourish and placed it on the table. It bore ink and stamps, and the kind of language that could be used to cut a line through someone's days. Notice of claim, intent to survey, instruction that property be tallied. He cited clauses and deadlines with a politeness that thought itself absolute. Colt kept his expression like a man watching embers. He did not mock. He placed a hand on the ledger as if physically asserting its presence. The neighbors who had come to stand, Mrs. Harlan with her shawl, the smith with his broad shoulders, the postmaster with his ink-stained fingers, had settled themselves like a small wall around the room. They were quiet. Their faces told stories in the few lines they carried. The sheriff read the paper, the sound of the words folding into the walls. He considered it, and the gravity of his attention made more noise than Keene's smooth talk. Then he looked at the ledger, and at the men who had come forward, and his mouth set in that way of a man who had decided to weigh one thing against another. "I don't make the law," he said at last. "I carry it out. For a man to be turned from a place, it takes a writ, taken out by a court, served, and then enforced. What this is now is a claim. It will be heard in town, means to a judge's ears. You're rightly concerned how fast such claims can be pressed, Miss Talbot. But I don't serve to drive a family to the road on the say of a man with a paper alone, not without a court order." Keene's smile thinned into the brittle edge of a coin. "Surely you'd not object to my conducting a survey of the property." "You can conduct your survey in the law's time," the sheriff interrupted. "But if you come seeking to put folks out without the court first making that call, I'll be bound to keep order, and order favors patience. You have the chance to pursue this in the clerk's office. I cannot in good conscience act upon a threat without the court's stamp." Keene's face reddened by the ear, then he drew himself up and tried a different tact, the promise of persuasion. He said quietly, "We could come to an arrangement. I have offers that would keep things smooth for all parties." Ellen's answer was simple, a ledger of facts that needed no warming. "We want to stay," she said. "We have lived and worked here. We will answer in town. I will not sell the work of these children's hands for a quick coin." Keene's silence was a practiced thing. He left the paper on the table as if it could sit heavy and wait. He stepped outside into the wind as if to let the cold remind him to keep his temper in better order. The sheriff watched him go, then returned to speak low with Ellen and Colt. "You gather who remembers," he said. "Names with clean hands. If it goes to court, they will matter. I'll do what I can to keep things civil until that's sorted. But you understand you might have to make a showing in the clerk's office." They nodded. There was gratitude in Ellen's chest for the sheriff's measuredness, gratitude that felt like possession, small and hard-earned. She felt as if some invisible hinge in the day had been steadied by the man's refusal to be hurried. When Keene left for the road, something in the air changed. The house loosened and then tightened in ways that made people step more easily into tasks. The neighbors waited not to be asked, but because they had come to give labor as an answer to need. The smith hoisted a new beam, and Colt showed a boy how to lift a purlin without twisting the back. Women brought jars and wrapped up bread. The kitchen smelled like yeast and hot fat. The children ran their small errands with a seriousness like an apprenticeship. Evening found the house full of work and slow talk. Mrs. Harlan sat by the hearth and spoke of the year her own roof had nearly been taken by frost. She would mention, in the kind of brevity that binds women together, how she had kept a receipt for 3 bushels of oats and who had seen the exchange. The postmaster produced a faded slip. A neighbor named Tom Jennings, who had once sold a draft of wheat in trade for Edgar's hand at a fence, stood a little straighter and said plainly, "I saw him at the field that spring. He was here." The way testimony gathered in that room was not theatrical. It was practical and quiet, and it landed with the weight of things that do not lie. Each name, each signed scrap of paper, each memory folded itself into the ledger like a stitch closing over a wound. There were nights when Ellen would find Colt out on the stoop, polishing the silver button by lamplight, turning it over as if reading a letter on metal. The button had acquired its small myth in the house. It had the private shine of a thing offered in trust. Ellen took to holding it in her palm, sometimes letting it fall between her fingers, and more often placing it back on the table where the light could find it. The object was small, but it made the ledger and the papers seem less like mere ink and more like a life lived. As spring pushed from the soil, the farm took on the slow rush of work. Seeds were sown in the thawed beds. Colt taught Levi how to drop the seeds at the right depth and gently cover them, and together they marked the rows with smooth sticks so the children could know where to step. Norah planted beans with careful fingers and sang softly to each row, not because beans needed song, but because none of them were above small rituals that coaxed a future into being. There came a morning when the surveyor returned and made note of the fields with a level and a careful stare. He was not an unkind man. He wrote on his pad with a kind of professional indifference that could be mistaken for fairness. He paced the borders and took the measurements that would be sent into the county docket. But the presence of the neighbors in the ledger had weight. The surveyor kept his distance and recorded what he saw without unnecessary questions. It was in the record. People living at the place, crops tended, dates and names. Paper had teeth, but people had memory, and both of them were sharper when set beside each other. When the day came for Keene to make a public declaration in town, Colt rode into the county seat and stood in the clerk's office holding the ledger like a shield. He had the signatures and the slips. He had the men who remembered and the postmaster's faded note. The clerk listened with the small politeness of one whose job it is to make a triage of claims. Paper would do its work in town. It needed a voice in the room. Colt's quietness was that voice, measured, taciturn, and resolute. Back at the house, Ellen paced more often than she had in months. She folded the ledger and smoothed it as if that action arranged fate. At night, Ruth sat up in bed and hummed, and the children slept with the safe comfort of chores completed. There was a fatigue there that felt like a slow, permanent bruise, but under it lay a resolve sharper than the need to keep warm. The time for the confrontation came on a morning when the sky threatened to reassemble itself into a storm. Gray gathered on the edges of clouds like a promise of trial. Keene came with more than one man at his side, and the sheriff rode in with a deputy both to maintain civility and because a town's business sometimes needed another official set of eyes. Keene had his papers and his survey. He had gentlemen from the town to stand with him. He had the kind of authority that comes from a pocket lined with influence and the habit of winning small bureaucratic battles. Ellen met them at her threshold with Colt a step behind her. Norah stood close to her side, and Levi shadowed by with a plank to lay, should the work call for it. Ruth leaned on a broom as if to give herself a steadying hand. The neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder behind them, a ring of faces that had carried each other through seasons of need. The house felt full of those shapes, their memories and small proofs, and they shone in the way people do when an honest thing is being defended by the many. Keene spoke first, all charm and flat business. "Miss Talbot," he said, "we intend to survey, and if the claim is found proper, take the formal steps thereafter." Ellen set the ledger on a chair without fuss and gestured to the names in the room. "We have witnesses who remember Edgar and who have seen the place worked. We have receipts. We are not idle." The sheriff listened with that particular stillness that made words settle into him and be judged. Keene tried a softening tactic, offering something in the way of compensation, an arrangement to buy the land at a sum that would allow the family to move on. His words were practiced, the sort that reduced a life to numbers. They supposed that a woman might accept coins for a house built of her hands. Ellen's answer required no flourish. "We don't want coin for what keeps our children fed," she said. "We want to keep the place we worked." There was such plainness in her voice that it felt like a beam set level. The sheriff regarded her for a long moment, then turned to the assembly of neighbors. "Speak plain if you'll speak," he said. One by one, the neighbors told their truths in short pieces. A man who had traded a wagon for labor told where he had seen Edgar drive the team. The postmaster read the slip he'd kept. A neighbor who had borrowed a tool in good faith and returned it with payment told when he had seen the family at the field. Each recollection was small, concrete, and unembellished. They were not speeches, they were facts laid down like stones. Keene tried to contradict with the paper. His survey and claim carried procedural weight, but the sheriff weighed what was in this room, the ledger, the signatures, the men and women who would swear on what they had seen. He did not make law, he made a decision about what must be done in the moment. "In my judgment," he said finally, "this is a matter for the clerk and a court. There is not here, on my reading, an immediate writ to dispossess. There will be hearings, and the county will decide. But I will not, in this place, carry out an eviction without the court's say." Keene's face tightened. He made a small show, papers shuffled, an edge of civility lost. He threatened to escalate to the courts, to take a longer, colder route that might unspool the family's days. The sheriff answered that was his right, and that is what law did. It had the patience to ride the long roads. Keene left less triumphant than he had arrived, smelling of ink, and having been denied the immediate triumph of the man who thought money and forms could erase a house. When the wagon left, there was a hush that had the shape of relief. It was not victory, it was a reprieve. It allowed them to breathe and to continue the stubborn work of survival in a world that measured worth in both coin and bread. There were things to do in the aftermath. Neighbors repaired the fence that Keene's survey had noted to be neglected despite its steady posts. Women plaited ropes, and men reset posts. Children planted more beans along the rows Norah had set, and Colt worked alongside them, not the hero of some story, but a man who knew how to lift and steady and mend. He taught Samuel how to hold the soil with both hands and tuck a seed like a small secret. The children learned that planting was a promise made with dirt and patience, weeks folded into one another. The clerk's office in town took its time, and when it called for a hearing, Ellen went with Colt and with witnesses. She stood in a room of wood and paper, and said her part plainly. Colt sat in the back, a steady presence, his hat on his knee, the silver button glinting with a life of its own. The clerk took notes, the judge listened, and procedures unspooled in their deliberate fashion. In the end, the facts in their ledger and the witnesses weighed more than Keene's paper had first assumed. The final dismissal, when it came, was not a trumpet of triumph, but a quiet, practical thing. The county found in favor of the family's possession on the grounds of continued cultivation and the witness of local men. Keene could appeal, he could file again, though every such action would take time, and time favored those who could show steady presence and the weight of a community that stood behind them. When the news reached the sod house, the sound was the low, simple cheering of people who had learned to celebrate with work. They did not shout, they made soup thicker and set more loaves to rise. The smith hammered a bell clapper for the church and left it by the door as a gift. Mrs. Harlan brought fresh butter. The postmaster brought an envelope with a clerk's note and set it next to the ledger like a feather on a map. Colt did not make speeches. He moved through the house with a kind of careful satisfaction, like a man who had done what he could and was glad to have his hands still. Ellen found him by the garden plot at dusk, his sleeves rolled, hands in the earth, where new shoots, tiny bullet green, had begun to poke through the loosened soil. The sight made both of them still as a pair that had found common ground. "I thought we'd better get seed in when the frost held," Colt said quietly, as if the weather were a partner rather than an adversary. "You'll tire yourself out," Ellen answered, but there was light in her voice now. "We've all worked hard." He smiled in that small way that did not make a show of anything. "Hard work keeps trouble honest," he said. "If you feed the land feeds back." They worked side by side until the dusk folded them in. The children ran between the rows, making forts of the rakes and pretending the turnips were treasure. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched, her color steadier than it had been in months. The house hummed with the ordinary miracle of tasks done and returned, boots hung to dry, soup ladled into bowls, dinner eaten at a table that had once seemed fragile but now felt like a thing that had weathered a wind and kept its hinges. That evening, in the hush after the children were asleep and the house had exhaled, Colt took from his pocket the small silver button and set it into Ellen's hand. He did not make a show of it. He did not say the speech that belonged to novels. He simply looked at the object and then at her. "It's kept me company on the road," he said. "Figured it's got no use on my lap if I'm to be staying a while." Ellen turned the button over, feeling the faint groove where time had worn it. It was small and warm from his touch. She thought of the ledger, of the postmaster's faded slip, of the neighbors who had come at the cost of their own time. She thought of the ways help had arrived, not as charity but as a barter, work for work, bread for labor, presents for presents. She took a small pin from the hem of her dress. Ruth had given it to her years before, a little mother-of-pearl thing that had been tucked away in secret, and pressed the pin into the button's plain face. It was not a ring or a promise written in blood. It was the closing of two small things to mark a mutual keeping. "You don't have to stay," she said, because she could not help the honesty. It was the truth she had learned to live by. One must always make room for a choice. "I know," he said. "I won't make the choosing for you, but if you'll have me here, I'll help. I got no fancy claim. I got my hands in a bit of craft." She smiled then, a soft private thing that had more meaning than words could carry. "Stay then?" she said, and it was as simple and as binding as the sowing of a seed. They did not promise a future that could not be named. They did not pistol off vows at each other. Instead, they anchored themselves in daily things. The button pinned now to the hem of Ellen's apron, a small sign that a man had chosen to be present and that a family had chosen to let him be so. Colt continued to rise before dawn and fetch water, teach Levi to mend plow points, and sit with Ruth when the cough came thin. He did the small exact labor that steadied a household. Neighborly life flowed on. In the evenings they met at the church and mended garments together. A harvest talk was made for the coming months. Who would loan a plow? Who would bring a seed that had done well in their soils? The community's solidarity, once abstract, became a practical resource, a rope to pull with when a house threatened to list. People traded labor and advice as if mending a house were no different than mending a fence. Both required hands and an honest clock. Spring shrugged off the last of its grudges and came in with a quiet generosity. The first shoots rose as if in answer to a long waiting. The children chased one another across the field, leaving behind the neat tracks of small feet in the mud. Ruth could stand at the post now and help shell peas. Norah laughed out loud as she found a surprise patch of green among the rows. They were all learning the new economy of hope. One afternoon, Colt walked to the corner of the plot and, without fanfare, drove a small stake into the ground. He looked at Ellen from across the row and tipped his hat as if offering the land itself as a seat to be shared. She met him, and with the light long on her back stood beside him and set a hand on the stake. "You know we don't make it easy for ourselves," she said. He glanced at her, and then at the field that had begun to hold color. "No," he said, "but we keep at it. That's the doing." Time, as it does, healed not by grand gestures, but by work repeated and kindness given. The ledger remained on the table, its pages fuller now of small notations. How many bushels were promised to trade? Who had brought which seed? Which neighbor owed what? The button sat on Ellen's apron, catching the light when she bent to cut greens. It was not a claim on her life so much as a notation. This man had chosen to stand with her. There were still letters that came and nights when the road was a thin black line on the horizon, but the house now had a clear interior life. Beds filled each night, food kept on the shelf, the small music of a family that had kept itself from being uprooted. The sheriff's presence had been helpful, and the county's slow machinery had proven, in their case, patient enough to allow truth to be told aloud. Keene would file again, perhaps, in some future lean time when men look for gains in other people's necessity. But the ledger and the witnesses had given the family a season's margin. They had, in the idiom of an unsettled country, bought time with work and testimony. And Colt stayed. He did not become a man of speeches. He became a man who knew which stakes needed setting and whose hands could be trusted to hold them. On an evening when the sky bled a long gold and the wind was softer than it had been when he'd first knocked, Ellen found him on the porch, hat in hand, looking out at the fields they had defended. He looked like a man who finally let a road rest under his boots. She sat beside him and did not need to speak. The sound of the house, the distant laugh of the children, the smell of baking, all these were the quiet things that made a life safe from sudden erasure. Colt's presence was one more reliable element in the ledger of their days. At last, as twilight softened the edges of the land and the day folded into a gentle close, Ellen stood and went inside to check the kettle and the children. She returned with a lantern and found Colt still on the step, hat tipped. A quietness settled over him like an old coat. When she reached him, she brushed her hand against the button at her apron, his small coin of silver, and in that gesture, the promise of their household was simple and clear. It was not a vow to never suffer again. It was a mutual keeping, small and resolute. The wind came at them now as a memory of its earlier voice, less ominous, more companionable. It ran across the prairie and found the house, found the hearth that had been kept, and whispered through the nearby hedgerow. Somewhere a horse stamped and the sound moved on like a rhythm. Colt rose and took his hat in a practiced motion. He looked toward the road and then back at the house, then at Ellen. "If there's trouble," he said, "we'll meet it steady." "We will," she answered. They did not need more words. Between them lay a ledger of deeds and a small object of silver on an apron. Between them lay the testimony of neighbors and the steady, unremarkable labor that would make next year's harvest likely. The storm that had first heralded his arrival now felt like a distant counselor. It had taught them what needed keeping and how to keep it. The mysterious cowboy who had knocked at their door had become, by slow degrees and unspoken labor, part of the house's story. When evening had come to a hush and the lantern cast a small constellation of light on the porch's boards, Colt lifted his hat, and as if answering the wind that had once announced him, tapped the button with his thumb. The sound was private and small, like a new line put into an old ledger. If you want to keep your boots on this road and follow more stories like this, subscribe and ride along. The house settled into the night with its children breathing soft and the fields lying like promised things beyond. The wind moved across the prairie, less an adversary now and more a witness, and somewhere beyond the rise a solitary rider, steady, unassuming, pulled his horse's head toward the place he had chosen to stand. The storm had come and the stranger had arrived. Now the work, quiet, daily and shared, would continue, and that in the end was the truest defense of a homestead.